Hey fam, I want you to like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Roland S. Martin. And don't forget to turn on your notifications. Earlier today, I was on Fox Business, and Charles Payne has his show on Fox Business. And so I got a call, and they said, hey, we're going to talk about Democrats and reparations. I'm going, all right, we can have that conversation. And so Deroy Murdock, a brother, he writes for National Review Online. They said that he was going to be opposite with me. Y'all could figure out how this conversation was going to go down. But let's go, just in case you missed it, press play.
Some 2020 Democratic candidates are touting their support for reparations for slavery. Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, and Julian Castro have all gotten on board with the idea. But before we all jump on the bandwagon, let's take a look at what the actual cost could be using those Pickford payouts to black farmers under the Obama administration. Of course, they were discriminated against by the USDA. Each were given $50,000. It was awarded to over 33,000 farmers or their heirs. So if we apply that same model right now to every black American and people of multicultural who say they have black descendants, then we're talking about $2.5 trillion. Joining me now to debate, Fox News contributor Deroy Murdock and hashtag Roland Martin, unfiltered host Roland Martin. Roland, let me start with you. I'm kind of surprised that 3 Democratic candidates have jumped on board with this as a central issue already. What do you make of it?
Well, first, we make the mistake by trying to automatically jump to the cost as to understanding why you're even having the conversation. When you talk about this year commemorating the 400th anniversary of 20-odd Africans arriving in Virginia in 1619, you have to look at American history to understand that it goes back to General Sherman and Special Order 15, 40 acres and a mule that was rescinded after Lincoln was killed. There was an effort to distribute land to freed slaves that was never passed by Congress. This nation it has always used the free labor of African Americans to build the country, but has never dealt with the reality of preventing black folks from being a part of the economic system in this country. Those are facts.
Deroy?
Well, here's a fact. Slavery ended 154 years ago. It's been a long, long time since we had slavery in this country. And you have people who've come to this country, let's say the great wave of immigrants who came around in 1890, 1900. I think they're going to be really shocked and disgusted if this thing goes through. And you have people who may have come from Poland or Russia or Ireland, and they suddenly have got to pay money to the progeny of people who have not been enslaved for 150-odd years. And you have people like my family. I'm black, but my family came to the United States in 1962. My parents are from Costa Rica. Do I get a check? We had no role in American slavery.
What do you say?
This is going to be the most divisive.
One second, Roland, I'll let you in, but I do want to ask, what do you say to the folks who says it just wasn't when slavery ended, though? The Jim Crow laws. And all the things that came after that stopped black people from being able to enter into the U.S. economy like everyone else?
I think a lot of what we did to address that involved things like the Great Society, many of these public assistance programs. Most of those were launched right about the same time as the 64 Civil Rights Act, and many of those things were done in a sense of trying to get people sort of in a better state economically.
Roland, Charles, are you concerned, Roland, about, though, what Deroy said, potential pushback from white folks in America saying, hey, I never owned a slave, and I don't know anyone who's ever been a slave.
Well, again, though, this is the problem when you have American history. And look, Deroy actually said it. He doesn't even fully understand American history. The Great Compromise of 1877 ushered in Jim Crow. You had 92 years of Jim Crow. You talked about the Pickford. Actually, it did not end. Allow me, this book, Dr. King, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community, where he talked about the issue, the practical cost of change for the nation up to this point has been cheap. He talked in this book where he talked about how even in 1967, 90% of the laws that were passed had not even been implemented. Here's the issue you're dealing with, Charles. You talk about the Pickford decision, the USDA discriminating against African Americans. The federal government's own housing policies, it was law discriminating against African Americans. The Fair Housing Act wasn't even passed until 1968, only because King got killed. So you could talk about slavery. There are African Americans today who were impacted by federal housing laws, and we know most wealth in America is a result of inheritance and also through housing. And so, Deroy, do you deny that reality?
Look, it's been 51 years since the 68 Fair Housing Act. Okay, that's half a century. You want total incredible acrimony and racial strife and tension like we've never seen before. You make white folks who had nothing to do with slavery give money to black folks.
You keep saying slavery, but you can't ignore Jim Crow.
Including people, I'm somewhat prosperous, as is Charles. Do we get checks as well? Do we give a check to Ken Chenault, who is the CEO of American Express? He doesn't need that money. I think we should put our efforts and our money into school choice, into things that help little poor black kids learn and get prepared so they can succeed in our society. Not create a formula for total racial chaos and mayhem, which I think
this is the mistake.
Awful, destructive policy idea that will demolish any kind of stability.
Speaking of destructive, you still have the people who built Black Wall Street in Tulsa, where the Oklahoma's apologized, but it's not paid for the damage. You look at Rosewood in Florida. We have facts where you have African Americans.
Roland, do you think every black person in America would be entitled to pay
One second. Here's the piece. In order for you to before you get to the cost, you need to study what the issue is first to understand that. And unfortunately, America has denied these realities.
Do you think every black person in America should get paid?
What needs to happen is you, as Castro said, supporting a bill that John Conyers submitted for a number of years. You need to study the issue first before you get to that. You can't deal with D unless you deal with A.
Yeah, you're pushing collective guilt.
No.
Deroy,
I'm pushing history.
Social division. Shame on you.
Deroy, I'm pushing history. And you don't know black history. You don't even know American history. I suggest you actually
study American history, read American history.
I suggest you learn more.
Future of total mayhem, which I do not want to see.
Let's leave it there.
Disgusting idea.
Passion on both sides.
Charles, read this book.
I'll read it.
Dr.
Deroy,
King, where do we go from here? You too, Deroy.
Thank you both very much. We'll be right back.
Don't y'all love dumbasses who actually can't read? Monique, I think you want to comment.
So the part of the I Have a Dream speech of Dr. King's that nobody really wants to quote.
That top part?
Yeah.
Right.
They quote the riffs, right? Because that's all
They quote
eloquent.
the dream part. Make us all feel good.
And it's real. But before that, he talks about that check that the United States of America has been, it came up insufficient funds back then. You know, it's been insufficient funds since we were slaves. And it's still a bounce check to this day. I don't care what they have to do to figure out who gets the check and who doesn't get the check. I don't care what they have to do, how many censuses they have to go through, whether the immigrants get it or don't. It has to be done. So these candidates who are taking the right stand in principle are, to me, taking the right first step. Now, how long it takes for all this to get figured out and how many Republican presidents we can survive and how many Republican legislatures before anything ever happens, I don't know. But this is very, very simple. Indians, Jewish people, how many others were given an opportunity for equality through transfer of property and or money?
Chris,
it has to be done.
Chris, I interviewed, I gave a keynote speech to a group of black construction companies. It was here in D.C. And I met a sister who was from North Carolina. And she's a lawyer. And part of her job, Chris, was to go out and check companies to ensure they weren't front companies. So she was talking to the sons of the largest construction company in North Carolina. She says, how did y'all get y'all start? And Chris, what she said was, the son said, well, our dad was in the Army. And it was the end of World War II. And he said, you know what, I'm going to start a construction company. So they had some surplus equipment in the Army. And he said, hey, y'all mind if I take some of this equipment because, you know, war's over, we don't need it. And they were like, sure. They were white. So he takes this equipment, he goes and starts his construction company. And as we were talking, I said, you can't find me a black soldier who got a shovel. Not equipment, a shovel. So here's this white man who used government benefits, government property, to start his construction company. And so now his sons are second-generation owners of the largest multi-million-dollar construction company in North Carolina because they got government property. And so when you have this conversation, people act as if, that's why I kept going back to, dude, you keep talking about slavery. You can't act like 1900, 1910, 1920, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70 didn't exist, because the point I was making when you talk about those laws, again, in King's book, he writes in 1967 that 90% of those laws passed were not even implemented in 67. You still had housing discrimination lawsuits that are continuing today. Yeah. And folks act like, well, it's no big deal. Y'all just making lots of noise. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not a big reparations fan. That's my view. But I think on the issue of reparations, what we really have to do is to educate people, not just on the end of slavery, but also on the effects and the lingering effects that helped move the needle forward. And I think that's a large part of the conversation. And in my experience, that's why a lot of people are simply ignoring it, because they're saying, well, slavery's over, without consideration of Jim Crow or any of those kinds of things. They're not taking a holistic view of it. And I think that frankly, is the challenge.
Doc, the problem, again, that was an issue that I was having with Deroy again. And my deal is, look, it's some folks who are born here who know what the hell he's talking about. Right. Just because he's from Costa Rica. But when Chris talks about effects, and that's the piece that people, again, don't want to deal with. And that is, how did you arrive at this point? The point I'm making about housing is, if y'all want to get into a debate about, well, slavery, that's fine. But for the purpose of the discussion, I'm going to deal with Jim Crow. The reality is, my parents were impacted by the inability of their parents from being able to purchase homes wherever they wanted to. We had clear and undeniable federal laws that kept black people from buying homes. White person over here could buy a home here, resell it at a much higher price. Black neighborhoods, a lot of the places they couldn't even own the homes there, and then the resale value was a joke. Black folks were greatly impacted by federal housing laws today. That's Jim Crow. That is what you also have to fix when you talk about, and what's the deal now? What's the black home ownership rate today? Not even 42%.
And in our neighborhoods are systematically devalued, and that is in today's dollars. So we don't even have to go to Jim Crow. We can look right now at how insurance industries and the lending industry have bankrupted black communities and undervalued black communities. But I will take issue with one point in this sort of conversation about, well, what about white people and how they feel? I am paying for a war. We are paying for a war we don't agree with, many of us, because we pay taxes. So when we talk about reparations for Japanese in the 1980s, black people paid for that. Native American people, Latino people who didn't intern anybody
paid for wars and had black soldiers who served in the wars fighting for freedom, and they could not take advantage of the very same freedom.
And reparations is essentially black folks giving America, the government, interest-free loan for the last 400 plus years.
It's a debt. And that's a debt. That's different than even paying for a war. It's like money we owe to another country. We don't have a choice to say, oh, we've owed that money since 1925. We'll just decide not to pay it. Of course, we don't pay our bills, but that's how it is.
But
Chris,
we all pay it.
Chris, my greatest problem with Chris Messler was Malik, my greatest issue with Chris Messler was talking about, which is my issue with Deroy and folks like him, is that they don't even understand American history. They don't even understand the fact that 243 years of slavery, 10 to 12 years of Reconstruction, 92 years of Jim Crow, and then if you use 1970 as the marker, black people have been technically fully free Americans for 49 years. And not only that, the reality is the Fair Housing Act was only passed because it was filibustered for 3 years, and Dr. King had to be assassinated for the House to actually pass it after the filibuster was actually ended in the Senate. But the thing that jumps out at me is that, which the reality, he's talking about, well, how are white folks going to feel? The problem is that there are white people who have no clue about American history, who have no clue about Black Wall Street in Tulsa, no clue about Rosewood. Those are just two that we know primarily because of a book and a movie. The reality is, you can go across the country and you can find Beaumont, Texas, Springfield, Illinois, numerous black neighborhoods that were burned down and gutted and destroyed because of racism, and it was done by cops who stood by government, politicians who stood by government, and none of those places were rebuilt. You can show black people who were run out of the South saying, nigga, we will kill you if you don't leave. Black people who literally left hundreds of acres of land to escape being lynched. that was not, and they were not being protected by cops. That is government. And so when you had, so when white folks, like I had one white dude who sent me an email saying, nigga, let me go ahead and read this here. And it was a trip. I need to read this for y'all to understand the reality, what you're dealing with. So he sends me this email, Jonathan Morse. You can pull your dumb nigga shit on CNN, but do yourself a favor and stay off Charles Payne's show. He is too smart for you and makes you look like a stupid fool. That's what I'm talking about. Go ahead, Malik.
Yeah. So here, it's hard to even respond to something as offensive as that. Unfortunately, reparations has, in many ways, become a distraction. You know, we can discuss ways, whether we're talking about the early 1900s, you know, the red line, the makings of the ghettos, for instance, the making of the ghettos
that were created.
Right, the makings of the ghetto, where we're talking about
by
Chicago.
City, county, state, and federal governments.
Whether we're talking about Chicago, whether we're talking about New York, the redlining that went on.
Yep.
You know, there are a lot of, and I think this is, you know, kind of what Chris touched on as far as how we deal with the vestiges of slavery, and whether that's through, you know, the era of Jim Crow. There are a lot of things that we have done. I think there are a lot of things that left that we need to do, but things that we're talking about in cities, you can just look here in D.C., you know, that you're talking about housing. You know, Ari Teresa, one of my friends, Ari Teresa actually just filed a $1 billion lawsuit against the District of Columbia because, and I think if I'm quoting correctly, for efforts to purposely displace black people in favor of gentrification. And I'm saying this to say, you know, this has been a bipartisan problem that both sides have ignored.
Well,
what reparation looks like?
This ain't both sides. No. This ain't both sides, okay? Because, see, in this case here, I ain't dealing with sides. No, I'm going to deal with sides. I'm going to deal with white. I'm going to deal with black. Those are the sides. They ain't left, right, Republican, Democrat. Because the reality is white folks benefited, Republican or Democrat. But this is the issue. And look, we're going to have other discussions on this. But let me say this here, and then I'll let each one of you comment on this before we end. And that is, you cannot find in American history 15 consecutive years of sustained black growth. 204, August 1619, first 21 Africans arriving. So you go from there to Emancipation Proclamation, 243 years. And when you look at 10 to 12 years of Reconstruction, 5 years into Reconstruction, white folks are like, all right, y'all, we good. All right, look, we done enough for y'all. 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, 1860 Civil Rights Act. What the hell more do y'all want? Okay. So then you go to 1876, the Great Compromise of 1877, gets into effect. Jim Crow, now 92 years. Emmett Till gets killed August 28, 1955. Montgomery starts December 1st, 1955. Let's say it goes through the Fair Housing Act. It's 13 years. It's 13 years, okay? But the reality is that still wasn't economic growth for black people. That was fighting for rights. Then, of course, you have Hatcher, elected mayor in Gary, Indiana, Stokes in Cleveland, Maynard Jackson, elected mayor of Atlanta, Coleman Young in Detroit, Mayor Marion Barry in D.C., these black mayors elected. So let's say, okay, fine, that's 70, say late 68, 80, what happens? Okay, growth for black folks in business, 0.0012% of the contracts in Atlanta when Maynard gets elected at 12 cents for every $100. That's 12 years. 1980, Ronald Reagan. In the affirmative action programs, Supreme Court rulings, okay, about 10, 12 years. But then when you go through Reagan, let's say you get to Clinton, okay, fine, you get to Clinton, okay, America goes up, highest point of black home ownership ever is there, and all of a sudden, Bush becomes president, thing collapses by 2007. We lost 53% of all black wealth. Now you're still trying to build. So the reality is, black people, for 400 years, went here, then here. Went here, then here. Then went here, then here. We didn't go here and come down to here. No, we literally went here and dropped all the way down here. So you have not had sustained economic. So we've literally had to restart every single effort, which is why if you look at black wealth right now, You see why it's $5,000 or whatever. Average white is $110,000. And Chris, that's what white folks who have no understanding of American history don't realize.
Well, and that's exactly it. The conversation has to be exactly what I said about effects. It also has to be about state actor and state action, particularly in the creation
or inaction
of ghettos. Or, well, yeah, inaction, but I'm talking specifically about the creation of ghettos from a housing standpoint. There were state actors involved in creating those. So we've got to look at all of those things and explain that. And it's not just white folk. I think it's a lot of folks, including black folks, who don't really understand that.
Monique?
Yeah.
Right, so the thread that you can see is from not being able to own property to creation of not just ghettos, but
being property and not being able to own property.
But that's what I was going to say, larger rental communities because of an inability to own. It's not just in the poorer areas where you're dependent on government housing, because that's what people say. They want to turn it into a personal accountability kind of issue. No, no, no. Because of the lack of ability to own the home, you're renting, and then comes gentrification.
And the rents were higher than the white folks who moved out.
You get the rent higher, but then the rental properties and the ghettos convert to ownership property, right?
We don't get
and then we cannot stay on our own land. So if they're trying to figure out when the harm stopped, the harm has not stopped yet. And so it's just a question of how you quantify the worth of that harm.
And just to mention, D.C. has the, and I think it was 2017 at that point, D.C. had the largest income disparity in the nation. In the entire nation. We have a very educated class here, but that's just another thing that we can look at when we're talking about, you know, things that we can do. Reparations aside, let's look at those type of policies. Let's look at what we're doing around gentrification to, you know, get black people, you know, to lift black people up. I think that's when I said that reparations in a sense sometimes ends up being a distraction. Let's talk about all of the things that the Obama administration is doing to address that. Let's actually talk about the things that the federal government is doing right now to address that. These things are happening.
But you can't, but the reality, Doc, is you can't deal with just the housing piece if you don't deal with the wages piece, and you don't deal with the education piece, and you don't deal with the other pieces. Housing. And that's the fundamental problem. America wants to have, that's why when you heard Deroy talk about the anti-poverty programs, what he did not want to confront is the reality that the anti-poverty programs were actually working. Read the book Nixon Land. They were working, but it was middle-class white folks who got mad saying, why is my money going to these damn black people, when the reality is a lot of the money was going to broke-ass white people, and the broke-ass white people would understand that if you even go back to the 1800s after the Civil War, broke white people's quality of life increased because of what freed slaves were doing. Go listen to Dr. King's speech he gave in Montgomery after the Selma to Montgomery March, where he talked about the advances that were happening between poor white people and black people. And it was rich white folks who said, oh, hell no, we can't have broke white people and freed slaves getting together. And so they utilized the media to create the wedge of Jim Crow, which has still lasted today, because you got broke white people who think, look, I might be broke as hell, but I'm not black. And so that's what you're dealing with. That is the story of America, Doc. And again, America has never wanted to own up to what it has done for 399 and a half years to people of African descent.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say whiteness is intoxicating, and white supremacy as an ideology that tells you that your white skin makes you better than everybody else. I mean, that's something to believe in when you don't have very much. And it didn't take much to separate poor whites from blacks. But I will say this, I mean, whether it is fair housing programs, I mean, we have to talk about health disparities. We have to talk about all of these things, because stress kills black people at exorbitant rates, right? We know it's not just about, it's about a lot of things, but it needs to be focused on black people.
But the other piece is here, when you also didn't have an opportunity to have a high-paying job, damn it, you can't afford health care. You've been frozen out. You were frozen out of Wall Street. You were frozen out of banks. You were frozen out of numerous jobs. That's the piece that that Deroy didn't understand when his parents come from Costa Rica in 1962. Like, dude, you don't understand. Black people were frozen out of every single level in America. You have black PhDs who were pushing brooms.
Well, and also it's also those same black people that made it possible for Deroy's parents to come here and have some of the freedoms that they did enjoy in the United States. So black people do a lot of the work for lots of other people, and a lot of people want the benefits and none of the burdens. But I will say this. We have to insist that if reparations, whatever it's going to look like, that it has to be focused on black people, because people say, oh, it's affirmative action. Affirmative action wasn't focused on black people.
No, actually it wasn't.
And the particularities of the community.
Well, first of all, it wasn't, because, again, for folks who don't even understand the history, that was affirmative action was put in place. White women have benefited more than anybody else. And in fact, you had a white racist out of Virginia, Homer Smith, who thought that he was going to shut down a 64 Civil Rights Act putting women in it, when in fact it actually had it passed, which is why I tell white women all the time, y'all run around talking about Title IX. That wasn't about no damn sports. Title IX is about opening professional schools, lawyers, doctors, dentists, professors, engineers, to largely white women. So y'all were benefiting from that. And if y'all ask where it came from, a provision of 1964 Civil Rights Act. And so again, people need to understand, they have no understanding, again, of history and how all these pieces fit together. Folks, do this here. I sent this to Charles Payne, and I sent to him on tweet as well. Again, and look, y'all can tell, I done went through 3 highlighters reading this book here. So y'all can see all the yellow that's in this page here. This book was written by Dr. King in 1967. He gets killed April 4, 1968. This book was not published a decade after his death. I think some folk did not want us reading. This is, I got 1,000 books in my library. You read this book, you'll be blown away, because he literally talks about what it takes in order for African Americans to be able to get ahead in America. The book is Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos or Community? If you want to order it, go to the MLK, go to the King Center in Atlanta, because you order from there, they get a cut of it, okay? So if y'all want to help the King Center, damn it, go buy this book. Every black person should have a copy of this book. I'm just being straight up. And real quick, before I went on the show, I had this book. Mary Frances Berry, we had her on the show, my previous show. She wrote this book. It's called My Face is Black, It's True, Callie House and the Struggles for Ex-Slave Reparations. So Mary Frances Berry, a former head of the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, actually wrote this book as well. Just an amazing book she wrote as well. And so I'll tweet both of these out for y'all as well, for you to check out. And so again, this is not the last time we're going to have the conversation. You're hearing the question that's come up. Again, the reason I refuse to have a dollar amount conversation is because they want you to short circuit the discussion. And so I'm not going to have a dollar amount conversation. And I think on the whole issue, when people say it should be for blacks only, no, you can actually create policies that are need based. And if you create very specific, now follow me, there's a way to do it, because again, understanding laws, I'm taking into account Supreme Court decisions when it comes to what is race-based. Right. I also understand that when you create need-based, damn it, you're still talking about us in some cases. It's just understanding how this game is played. Y'all should look up the the Clyburn Amendment, where Congressman Clyburn says that any federal bill passed, 10% of the money goes to counties where 20% or more of the people have lived below the poverty line for at least 30 years. And Chris and Malik.
And that's across the board.
But here's the piece. 2/3 of those counties are in Republican districts. But Republicans don't want to deal with that because they don't want to deal with broke-ass white people. All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment. All right, folks, calling all HBCU alumni, students, and leaders, enter the Ford Motor Company HBCU Mobility Challenge and win $25,000 for your school. Building on their long-term support of HBCUs, Ford is looking to improve mobility in HBCU communities through innovative solutions. The winning program will receive a grant of up to $25,000 to implement the proposal. Now, the deadline is to apply. It's March 31st, 2019. Go to FGB.Life for more information to apply. FGB.Life for more information to apply. And if you're watching, tell your HBCU that if they don't know about this, they need to be doing it. You should be pushing this on social media. Again, folks, 25 grand that could go to one of the HBCU campuses. Ford goes further in our community, and we certainly appreciate them being a partner here on Roland Martin Unfiltered. Now back to your Roland Martin Unfiltered video.